Hey there, and welcome to episode 4 of the Unapologetic Anthropologist. I am your host, Rebecca Ott, and we are jumping into one of my very favorite topics pirates, Vikings, and barbarians. Now, I will have to disclose I am a little biased. I am 17% Norwegian, so I do favor the Vikings just a smidge, so I do apologize. Figured let's get the biases out of the way. And on my past couple of episodes, if you've been following along with us, we have kind of been unraveling different myths and incorrect narratives that we've seen throughout history, and we are going to do just that today. Explain how empires shaped history and why the villains, in air quotes, may have been on the other side of the story. So let's just jump right into it. So, throughout this podcast episode, you're going to hear me speak a lot about the revisionist map because we are revisioning, reframing some of these parts of history that might be misconstrued in our noggins. So, what if I told you some of history's most infamous villains weren't actually villains at all? Pirates, Vikings, barbarians, we've all heard the story. We picture these bloodthirsty raiders, uncivilized savages, and just these crazy war stories. But what if those images weren't necessarily accurate? Where did we get that narrative from? And more importantly, who got to tell their stories? Our graphic to the left here, this phenomenal filler of history, really paints the picture. We have all these human events happening, and history isn't just about what happened, it's about who survived long enough to write it down and tell other people about it. So we have these different screens or filters in our funnel, as you can see here. Literacies, governments, and archives, especially religious institutions, belong to the empires, not the people they conquered, not necessarily the people that the stories are about. When we read about savages, we have to ask ourselves, who's telling the story? Because these literacy, government, and religious institutions may go through a process of canonization, may tweak that narrative a little bit, and that then becomes historical record as we know it. So that's why we really want to reframe, revision our perspective here. Let's keep going. And here we are with our first revisionist map. We are looking specifically at the barbarians, just a quick little case study. Now, I found this to be absolutely mind-blowing and kind of a little bit funny. Apologies out there. We are unapologetic, so let's be honest here. The word barbarian started with the ancient Greeks actually mocking foreign languages. We're mocking other humans. How ridiculous is that? So barbarians became bar. Very silly. The Romans then expanded it to mean anyone outside their civilization. If you're not like us, then you're not one of us, which causes a whole bunch of problems, as you know. Not really a great perspective to have against other humans. Now, these tribes that we talk about as far as barbarians, they actually had complex laws and trade networks showing a success within their society. But by portraying them as outsiders, we've pretty much justified conquering them at this point. This is not a description of who they actually are, it's a political strategy and reason. And that gets ethically very complicated, as we know throughout history, but it's just a really unique perspective on the word barbarian and where it actually came from. Let's take a look at another example. Now, looking to the Vikings. Now, a lot of our written history does come from religious monks. So that's where a lot of our myths are going to stem from, as you see here on the left-hand side, some of those horned helmets, bloodthirsty raiders, agents of chaos, versus our actual physical evidence found in archaeology that does show the Vikings as global explorers, farmers, craftsmen, and we even see some Islamic artwork and coins found all the way in Scandinavia, which is pretty impressive. Now, going back to these horned helmets, because I know that's kind of a big hallmark and false narrative when it comes to this specific culture, but that wasn't actually invented until the 19th century opera, which is kind of a unique rabbit hole to dive into. How does one wire get crossed with the other here? And of course, they raided. We're not going to discredit barbarians, Vikings, any of the people we're talking about today, pirates, from being violent. But imagine if you were being conquered by the Romans, you're probably going to be a little violent in your defenses. That makes a lot of sense when you're challenging, armies of the Greek and the Roman. Those are pretty expansive um, and monetized militaries to go up against. So just keep in mind our perspective here. But again, Vikings were the global explorers. Again, we've seen some Islamic coins and artwork in different places where it would not be if the Vikings were not efficient travelers. And again, most of our written accounts come from Christian monks. Those accounts naturally emphasize the brutality of the specific culture. So again, who is history written for and who is it written by? Not necessarily the Vikings, but just keep that in perspective. Let's go ahead and move on to our pirates. Now, I have to be honest, I haven't done a ton of personal research about pirates or their culture, but I thought this was absolutely mind-blowing. Yes, again, pirates were violent, they committed theft, they committed murder, they were not the staple of modern citizenship, but they also operated on a spectacular level. We see elected leaders, we shared loots and prizes. We also see a sense of injury compensation. So there's a whole democratic system going on here, and compared to some of these European imperial navies, which surprised me a ton. We think of pirates as these lawless, outliers of society, but really they've built their own society while being the outcast, which is pretty marvelous, at least to me. Were they criminals? Well, yes, legally, but remember, governments created laws, and the governments defined resistance to their laws as criminality. If you're not with us, you're against us, and you're strange. See how this is kind of reframing each of these violent, in air quotes, cultures, pirates, Vikings, barbarians. Yes, we have some underlying violence here, but you're missing the whole half of the story if you only listen to chapters or read chapters of history that were written by certain people who are not necessarily a part of that culture, but actually outcasting them. In anthropology, we call this outcasting othering, the anatomy of the other, where whether it's Greek versus barbarian, monks versus Vikings, empires versus pirate, the order is the same, the pattern's the same, the system is the same. One group defines another as fundamentally inferior, dangerous. They are absolutely not one of us. The other group is then labeled other or violent or brutal. Those labels, like we say, words matter in history, those labels become very important because now we have justification for exclusion, conquest, or violence against them, which nobody should be doing against other groups of humans. So we're really using this labeling system and words as justification to hurt other people. By calling them violent, we're now allowed to be violent, which makes no sense. And remember, this isn't just ancient history. Language we use today still shapes public opinion. Fear is extremely strong and motivating. Words like savage, primitive, illegal, or terrorist carry immense power and weight with people. Anthropology pauses to ask, who created this label? Who does this benefit? Who are we missing? What is the domino effect by simply using certain derogatory language? So, empire versus the others. We have civilized versus savage, lawful versus primitive or legal, official versus terrorist. I mean, these labels are completely strong and change our perspective of history, which is why they're even important today. As we get wrapped up here towards our final couple of moments of episode 4, I just want you to think, who has the power to define them? Who's writing these labels? Perhaps the real story isn't as bad or good as we thought they were. Perhaps we need to ask more questions because history is rarely black and white. Perspective shapes memory, memory shapes history. That old saying that there's two sides of the story and then there's the truth. And anthropology, especially this podcast here, we're really trying to dive in to that truth, that middle ground. Not that the Vikings and the barbarians were right, not that the Greeks and the Romans were right. What actually happened? Where is that middle ground? So just make sure you're keeping that perspective, especially as we move forward in our series. All right, everyone. I know we went through that rather quickly, but that wraps it up for episode 4 of The Unapologetic Anthropologist, our pirates, Vikings, and barbarians who wrote the narrative. Remember that anthropology doesn't just study humanity, it challenges us to rethink stories humanity tells us about itself to reshape our perspective. Remember to like this content, share it to friends who you think would be interested in this. Make sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all the latest content and episodes that are coming out. And until next time, I am your host, Rebecca. Stay curious and unapologetic. I will see you next time.